Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I'm going to be going over some of the most popular cards, if not the most popular cards in the game right now, according to some tournament data, talking a little bit about why these cards are towards the top and maybe some potential changes that we could see in the future. But let's get to it. So I want to get started towards the bottom of the list. And again, I'll go in reverse order. And this is all thanks to practical_TAS. So I want to give them a big shout out for posting this on Reddit. And I think it's really interesting to kind of see this, and I'll try to give you the percentages as well. But basically this is looking at 62 tournaments that have over 100 people entering. Okay. And basically it's saying, hey, this is counting drop games as losses. And it's basically saying that, hey, these are the cards that are played in the percentage of successful tournament decks. What does it mean by successful? It means that they have more wins than losses. So you could probably even deep into the data, or I guess dive into the data a little bit better if you looked at a bunch of top cut decks, but I don't have the resources to do that myself. So I'm just kind of taking the data that I've got in front of me. So starting off with Dredagon. So Dredagon is the, if you look at the number of cards on this list, I believe there's 14 cards on the list. And so this is number 14. So Dredagon takes up about 17.4% of the quote unquote successful decks. And again, that just means that they went, 5-4 or 6-5, or, just at least one loss better or one win better than their losses. And, it's not surprising to see Dredagon because, again, Dredagon is one of those cards that a lot of decks can use while they power stuff up on the bench and just kind of get extra time to find the pieces to their deck. So that makes a lot of sense. And then obviously it is the best stall Pokemon that we've seen, or the best wall Pokemon that we've seen in the game so far. And I do want to point out this too. If you ever go back and, for the future as well, if you look at my top 15 cards list that I do, or my top card list for each set, you'll see a lot of crossover between what we're about to talk about and the cards that I put on those top 15 lists. So pretty cool to see that as well. So anyways, here's Dredagon. And let's move on to another card that is more recent. This is from Spacetime Smackdown, and this is Darkrai. So Darkrai took up 22%. So that means like 22% out of all the decks in these tournaments that were successful played Darkrai EX. So I want to kind of talk about a couple of different things too when we go over these. This is like a main Pokemon, right? Like Dredagon is like your stall and wall. You're not really, like your deck is usually not playing fire and water energy. But with Darkrai EX, Darkrai EX is one of your attackers. So this is one of the highest ranking attackers in the entire game, according to like successful tournament runs. So that's kind of interesting. There's a few other Pokemon. I believe there's like 3 other Pokemon on this list. So out of this entire 14 cards, this is, there's 5 total Pokemon. 4 of them are attackers. So that kind of gives you an idea of how powerful Darkrai is in comparison to the rest of the Pokemon in the game. So another card that is very high ranking, this took up 23%, so slightly more than Darkrai. So 23% of the successful decks in tournaments out of these 100 tournaments that had at least 100 people played Serebii EX. And it, so again, like you start looking at this. So Darkrai and Serebii are 2 successful cards that have been built around when it comes to tournament gameplay. So that probably means, hey, if you're trying to build a tournament deck, for example, you probably need to account for beating these 2 decks, right? So how do you beat Serebii and Executor, and then how do you beat Darkrai variants, right? Whether it's the Weezing stuff, whether it's the Weavile stuff, or just good old Dark Zone with Magnezone. So just a little bit of idea on how to like interpret this data. And the other thing that I kind of like about this is there's Pokemon from each set so far. So we've got Spacetime Smackdown, we've got Mythical Island, and we have Genetic Apex later on. So the next card is Magnezone. So Magnezone actually it's at 24.9%, so it's slightly higher than Darkrai and Serebii. And when you take a look at that, it kind of makes sense because there's a lot of decks that just splash Magnezone, right? Like it's become the new meme, right? Can the deck play Magnezone, right? Like instead of playing, it started off with can you play Weezing in it? Can Can you have a deck that hey, just throw Wheezing in it instead of Wheezing, and instead of Drudagon, which Drudagon is still around now, the new trend is Magnezone, right? So Magnezone taking up this, a quarter of the successful decks in tournaments is not surprising, but it also kind of goes to show you like how powerful this card is, and it's a one prizer, right? So this is the first kind of primary secondary attacker that is a non-EX, and it's actually the only non-EX on this list. So that's really interesting. But again, like if you're looking at this list and trying to like figure out how to like solve the meta, you got to find a way to beat Darkrai, Celebi, Magnezone, and the next card, Exeggutor EX, right? So you've got to find a way to build a deck that can at least beat most of these cards, if not all of these cards. So as we look forward to hopefully more information on like a new mini set, that'll be kind of the barometer that we have to look at, right? Like, how does these new cards compete against Exeggutor? How do these new cards compete against Magnezone and Darkrai, right? And then obviously Drudagon and Celebi. So again, like this EX is from Genetic Apex, and it's really funny because like they were giving this one out depending on what pack you chose, right? I mean, literally people that start right now can just go get a guaranteed Exeggutor EX, and they've already got a piece of the puzzle to one of the best decks in the game right now, right? So again, Exeggutor EX, really powerful card. It takes up about 25.5%. So again, about a quarter of all the successful decks. So even though it's consistently being one of the most popular decks in almost every single tournament, it is also having a success rate to kind of coincide with the amount of times that people are bringing it to these tournaments. So very powerful card. And for the rest of this list, you're not going to see any other Pokemon. So keep that in mind, like Exeggutor, Magnezone, Celebi, Darkrai, Drudagon. And like if you think about it, like that makes a lot of sense, right? Like I bet if this list got extended, you'd probably see something like a Greninja, I would imagine. But again, like all of this makes sense, right? This is kind of going with a lot of the tournament data that we've seen, a lot of the top cuts. I'm sure Charizard and Gyarados are further down on this list, but again, almost a quarter of the successful decks are playing either Darkrai, Celebi, Magnezone, or Exeggutor, right? So that's something to think about again as you start constructing your decks. So now we get into the supporters. And, looking at the supporters, if you count up the number of supporters on this top list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 5 supporters. So this is the 5th most impactful supporter that is really interesting because it only is for grass types, right? So obviously if you're seeing a lot of Exeggutor and Celebi, it makes sense that you would see Erica on this list as well, and Erica is taking up about 26.2%, which again, all of these and keep in mind, I left this out at the beginning, but this means that tournament decks are playing at least one of these cards, right? So like they're playing at least one Erica. Obviously, the best thing you could do is probably play 2, but again, space issues and some grass decks. But in my opinion, the best grass decks are playing 2 Ericas because, I mean, it's good, right? It's really good. Obviously, with Exeggutor EX, it's fantastic. So let's keep going through the list. This is X Speed. So X Speed actually is a card that it's kind of interesting. Okay. So I want to talk about X Speed in the sense that there's an alternative to it now, right? Now we have Leaf, even though it's a supporter and like supporter versus item, it's a different thing. I just would say that because Leaf exists, the amount of X Speeds, it definitely like went down a little bit, right? So that's something to kind of think about. And like, you'll see this again with another couple of cards later on in this list. But I think that like the idea that I'm trying to bring to mind is that when we get new cards that kind of do similar effects, you start to see the play rate of the other version either drop or just completely fall off, right? It's kind of like Kangaskhan versus Drudagon, right? Like Kangaskhan pretty much fell off a map, and now, you see some people still playing it. Sabrina and Cyrus, that's another one, right? But Leaf and X Speed, it makes a lot of sense that, hey, even though X Speed is got 30% representation in these most successful decks, you definitely notice that, hey, it did go down a little bit with the introduction of Leaf. So that's something to keep in mind. So this is another card, and what's fascinating about this card is still higher than Erica by like a pretty significant margin. Like this is 41.8%. Versus Erica's 26%. But that just kind of goes to show you that even though we do have cards like Giant Cape now, people are still finding room to play stuff like Potion as well. And then Potion, because it can be played in any decks that's not just limited to grass types, you're seeing a lot of people play Potion. So again, like if you're looking at this from like an item and trainer list, Potion, I think this is like there's only like three items on this entire list. So 3 item trainer cards in this entire list. So that's pretty crazy that, a card that we saw day one, Potion, is still on this list, even though there's cards like Giant Cape and, there's other things that you can play now. Another card, and I referenced it already, is Leaf. Leaf is played in 48.6% of these successful decks, so almost 50% of the decks are playing at least one Leaf. And again, like when you take a look at this, that makes a lot of sense, especially like when you look at some of the other Pokemon that we saw on this list, like a Dredagon, right? It makes sense that if you're playing Dredagon, you got to play at least one Leaf. And then also when you start taking a thought about, okay, what about Charizard? Well, Charizard's definitely playing Leaf. When you start thinking about some of these other rogue decks like Gyarados, Gyarados plays Dredagon a lot of the time, so then you got double Leaf in that deck as well. So again, like it makes a lot of sense why you're seeing these cards have such a big play rate in successful decks, because, they're just really good at what they do. And although we do have alternatives like X-Speed, Leaf just does stuff that X-Speed can't in a lot of situations, right? And so that's why you see Leaf overtaking that higher percentage of deck space basically in these successful decks. All right, moving on to Rocky Helmet. So Rocky Helmet, again, the crossover, both of these cards that I mentioned, Leaf, it was in my top 5 for sure when I did that recap of Mythical Island and then Space Time Smackdown. Like I had Rocky Helmet, I think I might have even had it like top 3, maybe even number 1 at some point, when I looked at this card. And so Rocky Helmet is played in 49.2% of decks that are successful. And that makes sense, right? It's for one, it's just a really good card. And then for 2, like there's cards that like you have to play items, right? Like Pachirisu, 18 Trainer, you have to play tools, right? Skarmory, you have to play tools. Even when you get to like those big raid Executor EX decks, right, where they're playing 5 Pokemon with Executor EX, you need Rocky Helmet in some of those decks, even though I do think Giant Cape is better in those decks. If you're like looking at space issues, Giant Cape over Rocky Helmet in the Executor deck for sure. But again, like Rocky Helmet has continued to get a lot of play since the day that it came out, especially in tournaments and for people that are trying to, compete at the highest level. So I'm not surprised by this. It's just the gap between Rocky Helmet and Giant Cape is pretty substantial. So again, 49.2% is almost 50% of decks. So Sabrina is a card that this is a big gap between Sabrina and Rocky Helmet. So Sabrina is 63.8%, okay? And like if you were to break these numbers up into tiers, this is like a different tier, like a different tier of like how successful this card is in the most successful decks, right? So like Sabrina, for example, it's at 63% compared to 49%, 48%, 41% the previous 3 cards. So there's a gap between Rocky Helmet and Sabrina. And, that makes a lot of sense because right now, a lot of aggressive decks are specifically playing, one Sabrina, some are playing 2 Sabrina, and then they're also playing 1 Cyrus at least in a lot of those decks. And, they're just trying to basically be able to disrupt you or hopefully catch you where you have 1 Pokemon on your bench so they can Sabrina it out and hopefully do some significant damage or get a KO. So like this makes all the sense in the world. Cyrus is still, a lot higher on this list, and like I'll talk about those numbers when we get there, but there's still room for cards like Sabrina, even though a lot of people will look at Cyrus as being a straight up power creep version of Sabrina. Another card that has gotten a lot of attention, and especially recently as people have really started to understand how powerful Pokemon communication is in a deck with a low amount of basics, right? Like in the Executor EX deck, the raid boss deck, Pokemon communication is the absolute turbo nuts, right? Like Pokemon communication is the reason why they can get Executor EX, 60% of the time on their turn, on like turn 3 of the game or whatever. You know what I mean? Like there's literally like numbers and data that a lot of math people can do that I can't. But basically, when you start looking at how this card has impacted the game, it literally has shifted the meta, because if it didn't exist, Executor EX would not be able to be as consistent. And so, like, literally, when you take a look at Pokemon Communication, 68.4% of the most successful decks, again, so they're playing it, they're at least 6-5, they're at least 5-4, right? They're at least one win better than losses, are playing Pokemon Communication, and they're playing at least one copy. So again, Pokemon Communication, a card that I had very high on my Space-Time Smackdown list, and it's delivered. It just took a little bit of time for people to adjust to the card, and also a little bit of time for people to hop onto the bandwagon of that Executor EX deck. So Giant Cape. So in comparison, Giant Cape is 71.6% versus Rocky Helmet, which is 49.2%. And there's a lot of reasons why that's the case, in my opinion. So for one, I think Giant Cape, what it does is it allows you to get an extra turn out of your Pokemon, which can really throw off your opponent's game plan, versus the random times where Rocky Helmet will be able to, either create a stalemate situation where your opponent can attack or they get knocked out and lose the game, or they just wait till they can one-shot your Pokemon with the Rocky Helmet. And so because Giant Cape changes one-hit KOs to two-hit KOs, and because Giant Cape gets you out of one-hit KO range so a lot of times, I think that's the reason why we see more Giant Capes in terms of comparing it to Rocky Helmet. Now, what's this mean if you're building a deck? Well, if you're building a deck, you should probably look at can Giant Cape help my Pokemon stay out of range from being a one-hit KO? And then, you just have to learn how to play the card, right? A lot of the time, it's probably better to hold on to Giant Cape until you need to attach it, so that way your Pokemon gets that extended, that extension, and gets that extra HP so it can survive another hit. So a lot of the time, again, it just takes a little bit of time, but it's not surprising to me to see Giant Cape higher than Rocky Helmet. The only surprising part is that it's significantly higher. I mean, you're talking about 22% higher. That's a pretty significant jump from Rocky Helmet. But again, this is basically saying, 71%, 72% of the successful decks are playing Giant Cape. So Cyrus, this is another tier, okay? So I'll do a little bit of a breakdown on what I would call the tiers of these cards, because I think that we're very close to saying some things are staples that maybe were not considered staples before. But again, Cyrus is coming in at 87.5%, which that's insane. I mean, you start thinking about it, that means if you're building a deck, you basically have to account for Cyrus, right? If you're building a deck, you have to say, okay, well, if I, try to absorb damage and retreat out, pivot out, I'm probably going to get Cyrused. At some point in the game, I have to be aware of that. And so, there's got to be that line of thinking whenever you're constructing decks and whenever you're playing, even, randomly on the ladder. Dude, Cyrus is probably in a lot of decks, even in the random ladder, right? So again, 87.6% compared to Sabrina, which was, I believe it was 63%. That's a significant increase, between those two cards. And yes, Cyrus is a game ender, but again, Sabrina can be a game ender as well in some scenarios. But again, Cyrus, it's according to this, you could make the argument Cyrus is the best card from Space-Time Smackdown, and Giant Cape would be the second best card, But again, that's still somewhat debatable, right? I mean, where does Pokemon Communication come in, in that scenario, right? Okay, so the last two cards should be pretty obvious, and I'll give a little bit of pushback. Okay, so here's a little bit of pushback. Pokeball is in 99.8% of the most successful decks in tournaments. So it makes sense. I think the only pushback I would have is if you're playing, maybe a fossil deck, maybe you play only one Pokeball. But again, even if you only play one Pokeball, that meets the criteria of this graphic, right? So that means you're playing at least one copy of all these cards, if you're in a successful deck, right? So again, or if you're looking at the way that this data was created, again, you only needed one copy is really what I should be saying. So yeah, but again, I don't think there's any pushback to playing Pokeball in your deck. I think it's probably going to be a 2 of for the foreseeable future, even in those 18 trainer decks, right? Like I still think that you have to play double Pokeball, even though one is guaranteed to be dead. But in those 18 trainer decks, I think you just have to. And that's just because, you have to protect yourself from getting donked. And, you want to make sure that you can have multiple threats throughout the span of a game, no matter how short or long the game is. So, again, no surprise here with Pokeball. And number one, obviously, is going to be Professor's Research. This is no surprise. The only, pushback and, the only thought that I could give to Professor's Research is this. Is there an argument for cutting Professor's Research and playing more cards that help you win? It's really interesting because you have to look at Professor's Research for what it is. It's a +1, right? It's a +1 that lets you see 2 cards in your deck. And the flip side of that is if you don't play Professor's Research, you're seeing 1 less card, right? But you're seeing more variety of cards, right? Because you're playing, instead of playing 2 Professor's Research, now your deck can fit in, that extra Giant Cape or that extra Cyrus or that extra Sabrina. And so I wonder how far off are we from having a deck that doesn't play Professor's Research because it can either A, generate cards on its own, or there's just so many cards in the deck that are good that you don't need the randomness of seeing seeing 2 more cards in a turn. And I know that that's crazy to say, and honestly, I don't necessarily think that it's correct, but again, I just wonder, we see this as 100%, right? So all the decks are playing 2 Professor's Research, but again, I just wonder, is there ever a scenario where there's more value for playing a variety of cards and getting all the cards that you need for your win condition as opposed to playing a Professor's Research? I just wonder, right? And I haven't played around with it enough to really give a fair criticism to that pushback. I haven't played decks with no Professor's Research. But again, there's so many times where I've been building decks lately where I'm dang, I just don't have room for this. And I know that the +1 is helpful, and I know that seeing the extra card is helpful. But I just wonder, is there an argument for saying, hey, I was able to fit a second Sabrina in, or a second Cyrus in, or a second Giant Cape in my deck that basically makes my Pokemon better, as opposed to, hey, I played Professor's Research and then I drew a supporter and another card that I couldn't play, so I lost. I just wonder, right? I wonder. I don't know if it's correct, though. But let's break down these cards one more time in a tier list, and I'll give you guys a little bit of a different infographic here as well. So here we go. Here's a little bit more of a visual just to kind of go over in conclusion of this video. By the way, shout out to practical_TAS for this cool set of data. But again, pretty much I think that you would probably consider, for most decks, the staples are Professor's Research, Pokeball, and at least 1 Cyrus. As far as the best Pokemon in the game right now, I think the best Pokemon in the game, according to this, and I would probably say you look at most tournament results, it makes sense, would be Exeggutor EX, Magnezone, Celebi EX, Darkrai EX, and Druddigon. Then when you talk about the best trainers in the game overall, the best just trainers / item cards / tools, so not including supporters, I would say Pokeball, Giant Cape, Pokemon Communication, Rocky Helmet, Potion, and X-Speed. And again, that makes sense, right? I think a lot of decks can get a lot of value out of those cards. And then when you take a look at the best supporters, Professor's Research, obviously, Cyrus, you got Sabrina, Leaf, and Erica. Now, I did one more breakdown where I broke these cards into tiers. And I don't know, let me know what you think about this as we wrap this video up. But basically, my kind of thought process is, as far as tier 0 cards in the game, I think that list of cards is probably considered tier 0, right? These are, I think those are the best combination of EXs. I think those are the best combinations of Pokemon. And I think that obviously the supporters and the item card that are in there are just really good. Like they're pretty much the best cards at what they do, and arguably the most oppressive cards as well. Now you'll notice I did slide Dredagon down, and that's partly because of like it does have a lower percentage when you talk about like the 17.4% compared to the others, and I wanted to kind of at least separate that. When you take up a what is it, a fifth to a quarter of every successful deck, I think you can kind of classify that as a tier 0 card. But again, you take a look at the tier 1 cards, Giant Cape, Pokemon Communication, Sabrina. Obviously, I think, that makes a lot of sense. Then we take a look at the tier 2 cards, Rocky Helmet, Leaf, Potion. Again, like it makes sense, right? Like those cards are probably going into decks that are trying to do a specific thing. Whereas Giant Cape, Pokemon Communication, Sabrina, Dredagon, a lot of those cards can go into most decks, right? Obviously, you'd have to build around with Dredagon. You'd have to build around with Pokemon Communication a little bit. But again, like a lot of the best decks, I think, can utilize those cards, and so that's why I would kind of separate them. And then lastly, the tier 3 cards, X-Speed and Erica. I mean, you can make the argument Erica should be at least tier 2, but since it's limited to only grass types, even though grass is dominating, you just imagine if grass does fall off, that you would move Erica off of this list altogether, most likely, right? Like this is essentially like saying Blaine is one of the best cards in the game, right? This is like saying, obviously cards like Misty are great, but that would be like saying, yeah, Misty is so good, even though it's a coin flip, it's in a large percentage of decks as well. Like that's Erica is just really, really good at the moment because we really don't have anything that can check Executor EX, right? Like I mean, a lot of the things that can one-shot it, like you really have to do a lot of work to get to, and like there's a chance that Executor EX can just flip heads and KO it anyway. So let me know what you guys think about this breakdown. And again, I look forward to seeing the sneak previews and hopefully some a trailer with the assumed mini set coming up. And I'm ready for something new, so stay tuned. Definitely hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Give me a thumbs up to get this video in front of more people. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day for me to be background noise. Maybe it was entertainment, or hey, maybe you learned something. And until next time, peace.